Good morning, everyone. We're going to be talking about sort of the second lesson on the series that we were just introducing. We just recently talked about the battle between Judah and Israel, and we're going to go into some of the greater details. The last lesson, I just sort of retold the story about how David was crowned, and then he sort of established himself as king in the southern part of Israel and Judah, and Ishbosheth was set up as a puppet king in the northern part of Israel, and then the two armies came together and battled at the pool of Gibeon, where nothing was resolved between the first hand-to-hand combat. So then the two armies fought each other, um, and David's army won with only a few deaths, but the most significant of those was Assahl, um, one of David's officers, was killed by Abner in the heat of battle. And we sort of left it off there, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail with this specifically. And as you can see, the very first picture shows the two armies sort of meeting together. Now, these pictures aren't perfectly accurate. This is likely not the type of armor that everyone would be wearing. But, the idea is still the same. You have the two armies on either side of the pool of Gibeon, and they're in conversation with each other. This is right before they have their hand-to-hand combat with the 12 men of each side. But we're going to go through some of the important characters and sort of get a sense of who they are and why they're so significant, because some of these characters are going to be reoccurring over the course of David's kingship, and we should have a good sense of who they are. So the most important person that we're first going to talk about is a man by the name of Joab. He's the man with the red headband that you see on the left of the picture. So Joab is a significant man in David's army for a couple different reasons. So first and foremost, just to have a sense of who he is the son of Zeruiah, who is David's sister's husband. So that means he's David's nephew. He is one of the commanders of David's army, and he is extremely loyal to David. You could say he's one of the most loyal people there are to David. Except one thing about him is he's impulsive and ruthless. Impulsive is people that make decisions quickly, and ruthless is people that don't show a lot of mercy. So, as a fighting man or as an army, you want someone like that to be sort of in charge because they'll make the tough decisions. Now, as an ally, it's not also as good because sometimes they make unwise decisions and you sort of have to deal with the consequences, which is what we hear from Joab and what happens in the future. So, Joab is on one side of the army, and that's on David's side. The other significant person, sort of, we could say the opposite of him or the his counterpart, is Abner. Abner is the other side of the army where Joab is aligned with David. Abner is aligned with Saul, or currently he is aligned with Ishbosheth. Um, Abner is Saul's cousin, so he is extremely loyal to Saul, or was loyal to Saul while he was alive. He was the commander of the Israelite army, so he's the sort of the counter of Joab, who's the commander of David's army. Now, something we've heard about Abner, or at least we can infer from what's happening in the Bible, is that he is extremely clever politically. Um, that means he understands when power can be taken or when power can be used, or sort of allows himself to be put in positions of significance. And we hear that for the first time when Saul has just died and there's a power vacuum. That means there's an opening for someone to sort of step in and take charge. And Abner elects to set up Ishbosheth as the king of Israel instead of himself, because Ishbosheth is Saul's son, and because Abner is well known. He is able to sort of put up this, in a sense, puppet king. That's someone that's going to listen to him and do what he says, and that he has significant influence and sort of control over, while not actually being the king himself. So that's Abner, and he's going to come up a couple times in the course of the story. Then we have Abishai. So Abishai is Joab's brother. He is a rank lower than Joab because Joab is the commander of the army. Abishai is a high officer in the army. So you can kind of imagine like one step below him is Abishai. Now, this is going to come up later in the stories, but he's chief of the three. There are three men that are specifically mentioned in Chronicles as David's soldiers that are unbelievably excellent soldiers, and they have small sections in the Bible that actually talk about some of the things that they've done. So he's chief of the three. So he's one of the best soldiers David has, the most adept. Um, and Abishai, unsurprisingly, is loyal to Joab, and also loyal to David. Now, I have it in a specific order because Abishai is first loyal to his brother, and then he's loyal to David. If you want to have sort of, if something happens and he has to make the decision between Joab and David, he would likely go with Joab, and that's going to come up as the story continues. Okay, and then their younger brother is a man by the name of Assahl. So he is Joab and Abishai's brother. These are all nephews of David, remember? And he's just an officer of David's army. So we have the first man who was Joab. He is the commander, and that's the highest ranking. And then we have a high officer, and then we have an officer. Okay, so Asahel's an officer of David's army, still a significant person, but not as significant. Um, and he is a part of a smaller regiment known as the Mighty Men. There's about 30 soldiers of David who are, you could imagine, like the most elite troops he has. Sort of the ones that would be doing extra dangerous tasks or would act as David's personal envoy and guards or those sorts of guys. He's one of the officers of those 30 mighty men. So he's still very significant. He is loyal also to Joab and David. And this is sort of where Asahel becomes a significant character in this story, because when the battle happens at Gibeon, Asahel sees an opportunity to take on Abner, and he pursues him quite aggressively. It even describes that Asahel pursues Abner, and Abner says, like, go away, turn away from me, and there's opportunities for Asahel to continue on, and he does so. So over the course of that battle, eventually Asahel and Abner get into melee combat with each other, and Asahel falls and dies to the spear of Abner. And this sort of has consequences later on in the story. So that's who Asahel is. He's the youngest brother, or he's the least important of three brothers that are extremely important. So an officer of David's army is still a pretty significant man. Okay, now, so what's happening at this point in the story, now that we have these sort of characters introduced? So there's sort of three cities of its significance that are mentioned in these last two chapters of 1 Samuel, or 2 Samuel 2 and 2 Samuel 3, and that's Hebron, Mahanaim, and Gibeon or Gibeah. So Hebron is, or Hebron, whatever you want to pronounce it, that's the city where David is set up as king. And that's in the southern part of Israel. This is a map of the kingdom of Saul, and I've highlighted the three important cities that I'm talking about. Hebron is the one on the south, and that's the one that David sort of takes ownership of. It's a very important city. It's a burial place of the patriarchs. It's also a city of refuge. If you don't know what a city of refuge is, we're going to talk about more of them in the future. But a city of refuge is somewhere where if someone were to, essentially, it's a place where anyone can go and not be killed. And now that seems like, well, you should be able to go to most cities and not get killed. Israel had a different sort of system where people could accuse other people of doing something wrong, and sometimes the consequences of that would be death. So say there's someone that murders your brother and you see it happen, you would be within your right, and your family would be within their right to kill that person because they killed your brother, and you saw it happen. It's not a matter of like, oh, I got to sort of figure out these clues and be a detective and stuff like that. It's like, no, I saw this happen, and the consequence of this is that person should die. Now, what happens is that person that, say, killed your brother could flee to a town, a city of refuge, and sort of allow his case to be presented. And in the city of refuge, everyone is completely safe. Okay, so it's like T in a game of tag. Okay, or it's like a little safe spot in a game of tag. That's almost how you can imagine a city of refuge. Now, it has a lot more larger significance, but if we sort of want to boil it down to one idea, that's kind of the situation that a city of refuge is. Okay, so it's a place where anyone can be safe, um, and they sort of allow themselves, once they get into a city of refuge, that they're essentially saying, I want this to be brought before some sort of judge, and they can sort of make a decision on it. So in a city of refuge, everyone is safe. That's important to remember, and it's something that is a part of the culture. Um, So you would essentially, no one would kill in a city of refuge because you're not supposed to, and everyone knows that. It's a well-known fact in those times. So David ends up crowning himself in Hebron, in a city of refuge, but also it's a burial place of the patriarchs. It's a pretty significant location in Israel. Um, and many people would know the significance of it. And David chooses it for a purpose. Um, Now, Ishbosheth gets crowned in Mahanaim, which is more in the northern part of Israel, which is also an important place. But this is one of those locations that Mahanaim is actually the original name for it, means two camps. And there was a Bible story where there was a man who sort of witnessed something happening, and there was sort of two camps that the man was found himself in. We just want to get the sense that it has some significance in Israel. It would be a well-known place, maybe not as well known as Hebron, but still an important place. And then the last place I wanted to highlight was Gibeah or Gibeon, and this is where the two armies, the army of Judah and the army of Israel, fight each other. Now, I know that on the map it says Gibeah, and I put in brackets Gibeon. The exact location of where Gibeon is isn't super well known. Um, Even the location of Mahanaim isn't perfectly known. People sort of have a good estimation, but one of the issues with finding the location of where Gibeon is or Gibeah is a part of that name actually just means hill, and if you know the geography of Israel, it's extremely hilly. So there's lots of places that have that sort of similar name to it. But our best guess is Gibeah is likely Gibeon or similar. Um, so now what happens? So the battle takes place, and Joab ends up killing. No, sorry, Abner ends up killing Asahel because he's being pursued, and then Abner is able to sort of get to a hilltop with Benjamites around him who are a part of his army, and Joab and his brother um, Abishai get to get to the bottom of the hill, and they sort of have a conversation with each other, Abner and these other guys, and they sort of resolve, okay, like we're gonna leave it at this. But there was a fierce anger in both Joab and Abishai for the death of their brother Asahel. Now, I mentioned this before in our story, but in battle, people aren't considered murderers. Um, because battle sort of changes the rules of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And in this situation, we find that technically speaking, in accordance with the rules of Israel and the way that they sort of have done their things for a long time, Abner's not a murderer and shouldn't be considered a murderer. And to take vengeance upon him because of the death of a brother isn't really, we can say, fair or traditional or that sort of sense. There's no legal sort of background to that because a battle took place and someone died. That doesn't make that person a murderer. A murderer is more, outside of battle, intentional or even unintentionally, you could still murder someone. Um, but there's an element of that there wasn't some sort of agreement between both parties that something was going to be happening, right? So if Asahel had ended up killing Abner, it wouldn't have been appropriate for Abner's family to go kill Asahel because it was in battle. Okay, so that's kind of where we're getting at. And now, why does this all come up? Well, what happens is Abner is put in a situation sometime after this battle where he's been working with Ishbosheth, and Ishbosheth has sort of been getting rubbed the wrong way. The fact that he's realizing that he's not really he's not a king that can make his own decisions. Abner sort of has a lot of sway and control in what decision Ishbosheth makes. And so what happens is Ishbosheth accuses Abner of doing something bad. He accuses Abner of sleeping with um, one of the concubines of the king. Now, that in itself is not a good thing, obviously, but that sleeping with a concubine of the king in Israel at those times is essentially putting a stake on the throne. So it's the same as saying, I'm going to be the next king, and you're out. Okay, so there's it's not just a matter of like, oh, I really like that concubine, so you shouldn't have done that. It's actually more like I'm going to take the throne from you. So there's some pretty significance. So when Abner is accused by Ishbosheth to sleep with one of his concubines, we don't even know if it's true. Abner obviously reacts pretty strongly, and so what he decides to do is he goes to meet David in Hebron. Okay? So Abner goes to Hebron and he says, "Listen, this whole thing with Ishbosheth is not working out. He's accused me of this. I don't want that. That's not what I'm about. But what I do want is I want you to be set up as king." Abner and David would have a relationship from before. Abner was a commander of Saul's army, but also David played a pretty significant role. So the two of them would definitely know each other and would have some sort of working relationship. So when Abner defects and sort of goes over to David, he sort of sets up the Benjamites and the Israelites to sort of accept David as their king. And essentially he's saying, okay, listen, Ishbosheth, you're out of here. Um, that's a sort of a big move. And that sort of gives us the sense of how politically clever or adept Abner is. Now, what happens after this is Abner and David have this conversation. They decide what's going to happen, and everything's all good. So Abner's going to sort of take his envoy with him, and they're going to head back to where he's from. Now, just as that happens, Joab returns from battle with 20 men, and he hears about how Abner was just in Hebron talking to David, sort of setting this up. And Joab is impulsive and ruthless. And so what he does is he actually sends a messenger to Abner and says, "Oh, Abner, come back. Actually, we have something to talk to you about." And so Abner, knowing that he's in a city of refuge, doesn't really think much of it because Hebron, again, is a place where you can't kill someone. You can't sort of take vengeance in the city because it's a place of safety. Um, so he essentially convinces Abner to come back. Um, and then this picture depicts sort of what happens. Now, it's not accurate, obviously, because, well, there's lots of things that aren't accurate about this picture, but I just wanted to have a sense this is a sort of a famous art tapestry of what happened. What essentially happens is he takes an opportunity. This is Joab, and he kills Abner in the in an inner room of a house. Um, and David reacts extremely strongly to this. So the one thing David doesn't do, which actually causes a lot of strife in the future, is he doesn't directly punish Joab. Joab has done something which should be easily punishable. Um, First, by essentially murdering someone, and not just murdering someone, but murdering someone in a city of refuge, and murdering someone in a city of refuge that just had an agreement with David. So it's kind of like three levels to how bad of a thing Joab did. And David's punishment for Joab is very weak. He essentially like publicly says, I do not condone this. This is not what I would do. This is wrong of Joab, and I'm going to sort of put a curse upon their family where no one in his family will ever have, there will always be one person in his family that will have something wrong in their life. Something like they will either be a cripple, or they will have leprosy, or they will blah, 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 all these different things. And then David has an opportunity for all of Israel to mourn the loss of Joab. And David sort of pivots on this moment to sort of consolidate his power in Israel. Now, while all this is happening, I know it's going for a while, sorry. While this is all happening, two Israelite men take it upon themselves to kill Ishbosheth because they think that's what David would want them to do. So they end up actually killing Ishbosheth, returning the head to David, and then we'll sort of take up the story from there. But I hope this was helpful, and I hope it gave you a really good sense of what's happening in Israel at this time. So yeah, that's our story, and I will see you tomorrow.